Hello, everyone. My name is Max Fawcett, and I'm the lead columnist with Canada's National Observer. On today's show, my guest is Dan Arnold, the Chief Strategy Officer at Polera and former Director of Research and Advertising for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Dan is an unabashed data nerd, and his firm's recent poll on separatist sentiment and support in Alberta caught my attention in a recent column, and now we'll get a chance to dig a little deeper into its findings. So, Dan, welcome.
Happy to be here and to dig into the data today.
Excellent, excellent. Um, I have to admit that your survey gave me some mild heart palpitations. I've been trying to convince myself that the threat of separatism was largely nothing to get too concerned about. We will win this referendum in a walk, and your survey painted a slightly different picture. So can you take us into maybe where the risks are for the Federalist forces in any separatist referendum in Alberta?
Yeah, I think like when you just look at the top line number, we've got support for separatism in Alberta at 27% among decided voters, which is, I think, pretty consistent with other media polls that are out there. Now, this is the highest we've recorded. Polara has been tracking this question for 6 years. We were asking about separatism before it was cool to ask about separatism. It was more of a hypothetical, like how would you want the prime minister to deal with an alien invasion and those sort of things. This is now a bit more real. Support is at 27%. It's been kind of in the 20 to 23% range over the years we've been tracking it. I think as the conversation starts to become a bit more real, people start to look at these issues a bit differently, especially when you have political leaders that are kind of giving, I would say, tacit approval to sort of pick your side on this sort of thing. So, that is in and of itself concerning. But again, under 30%, maybe there's reason to say like, okay, nothing to worry about here. But there's a few questions and data points below the hood that give me a bit of a pause for concern. The first is that we asked people who said that they would not vote to separate, or who were undecided. Would you consider maybe casting a protest vote as a way to send a message? Even if you don't want to separate, would you consider voting yes, just as a way to, send a message to Ottawa? And about 1 in 5 people said that. If you add those people on top of the 27% who say they want to separate, yeah, suddenly you got a number of 42%, which is a little close for comfort. Now, obviously, not all those people will vote to send a message, but I think it just shows that there's some potential out there, right? And if people, kind of, if the question becomes about something different than separatism, as these referendums have a way of doing. Obviously, Brexit started as one thing, and then it became about control over the healthcare system and control over immigration. And even the Quebec referendum in 95 kind of took a turn once Lucien Bouchard came back and started to talk about partnerships and things like that. So, I think there is a risk here that, if the conversation drifts, we know there's at least another, 15%, if not more, people out there who are open to a different type of message. And I think, 27% support today could be something very different as the year goes on.
I want to float a theory for you here, and you tell me if I'm out to lunch or not. I've had a lot of people ask me who aren't in Alberta, why is the Prime Minister being so delicate with Danielle Smith? She's blown deadlines, that they did a deal on methane, and then a couple days later, the Alberta Energy Regulator floated draft regulations that were basically at odds with the deal they'd made. It seems like he's being very careful not to do anything that could be perceived as Ottawa attacking Alberta. My theory is that he's doing this precisely because of the send a message risk that you outlined in your survey, that if the ballot question shifts away from do you want to separate and towards do you want to punch Ottawa on the nose, it gets very bad very fast for the Federalist forces. And I think he is very mindful of that risk. Does that wash with you?
Yeah, I think it obviously, the prime minister being from Alberta, I think would have a decent sense of kind of what the psyche is there on the ground. And you're right, like Alberta separatism is driven really by this historical grievance. And actually, we've got a poll. I'm working on a bit of a thought piece on this, which we'll put out for some polling. I'll give you the sneak peek here in a week or two. But we were comparing Alberta separatism and kind of what the motivations are there to Quebec separatism. And Quebec separatism is very much, as you would imagine, about language, identity, and culture. The number one reason people give for being open to Alberta separatism is that they've been treated poorly by the federal government over the years. So I think, there is a risk, obviously, that the federal government becomes seen as, the person trying to hold Alberta down, and the referendum becomes about that. Now, like in fairness, Carney is not a lightning rod of anger right now in Alberta. And we asked in the same poll kind of how people felt about different political figures. He's got a net positive impression rating in Alberta, but 1 in 5 Albertans are angry towards him. You go back to the end of the Trudeau years, and it was close to 50% of Albertans were angry towards Trudeau. So, this is not currently something where Mark Carney is the big bad who is fueling Alberta separatism. But, a few missteps along the way, or something goes wrong, or he makes the wrong comment, or, does something that is seen to be an affront to Alberta. And for sure, the referendum is suddenly not about separatism. It's about, this is your chance to give Danielle Smith a stronger negotiating position for getting something out of the federal government. And I think that's, yeah, really where the risk lies.
If you were designing the anti-separatism, pro-Canada campaign, would you, based on the data you've seen, would you recommend any particular party or any particular politician be its figurehead? Or do we need sort of a coalition of the willing where it's Jason Kenney, it's Naheed Nenshi, it's everyone who isn't sort of a rank separatist lining up together? What works better, do you think, based on what you've seen?
Yeah, I think you need a coalition. I think you need to have conservative voices in this. If you look at the breakdown, 97% of Alberta NDP voters would vote against separatism, and there's like a 2% margin of error in that. So maybe it's 99%. Whereas UCP voters are pretty evenly split. Like we actually had just over half actually of UCP voters who would vote to separate, and for federal conservative voters, it's an even 50-50 split. So I think you need to have conservative voices there. Like Stephen Harper might be the best voice if you're trying to like pick someone out of a hat who could do this. But I think, yeah, the Jason Kennys of the world, like it'd be nice if Danielle Smith was a little stronger in her opposition to separatism. But failing that, other prominent conservatives speaking up, I think would be helpful because there's a lot of conservative voters out there. And look, people take the lead from political leaders. We've seen this over time. Like you look at the states suddenly Republicans think Vladimir Putin's an okay guy and free trade is a horrible thing with Canada because political leaders say that. And that would not be the case 10 years ago. So I think having more conservative leaning political figures being strong, fierce advocates of Canada in this referendum would be helpful. But obviously, you want people from across the whole spectrum there.
Is there a risk that I don't know if it's the Alberta NDP or if it's the federal Liberals or some other progressive group sees an opportunity to split the conservative base here, whether it's the UCP, whether it's the federal Conservatives, and kind of puts their partisan self-interest ahead of the referendum campaign, thinking maybe that there's no real chance that they could lose, and so they might as well try to take the opportunity to pursue this other agenda.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want it to be polarized. I think that it is one of the risks here is this becomes a thing where it's like, liberals, NDP are on one side and conservatives are on the other. Now, I'd be hard pressed to like accuse the, provincial NDP or federal liberals or anyone like that of exploiting this issue because this issue is being brought to the forefront by the conservatives. They're basically running a wedge issue against themselves. If you want to look at it that way, it's an issue that splits their base, but they seem to be the ones driving it. So, I don't think you can fault those other voices for speaking out for Canada. And there's a mobilization question here as well too. Another thing we found in our poll is that people who are voting to separate are twice as likely as those who are voting against separatism to say this could be a close vote. So there's a risk that,
Hmm.
yeah, people are complacent on the stay in Canada side and they say, okay, yeah, like this thing's going to fail. Obviously, this is a crankpot idea. I'm not going to bother to go and vote because I know it's going to not be successful. So you do need people to mobilize, those progressives, those people who are on the other side to make sure they actually turn out and vote. So I do think there's a role for all of those political figures. I wouldn't invite Justin Trudeau back to campaign, but I think for sure Mark Carney and Naheed Nenshi have a place and a role in this discussion because they got to make sure that their people turn out to vote. Assuming we get to an actual referendum.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Is it fair to say that the pro Canada campaign is going to be less about kind of going out there and fact checking separatists, proving them wrong, bringing good arguments to them, and more about just activating the pro Canada voters who are not super engaged, who think it's in the bag. It's more about a motivation of your own side campaign than a convincing the other side campaign.
Yeah, I think at least among the people who are more already in that progressive side, again, provincial NDP voters are already you don't have to convince them. They already are voting that way. So for that side of things, I think it's really a turnout exercise. So I think the Alberta NDP's job here is just to make sure people turn out. It's not to convince people. I think again those conservative voices maybe have a bit of persuasion that they should be trying to do to get people to change their opinions. And I think we've talked about the risk of support for separatism going up. There's also a real chance it could drop over this year. We asked in the same poll, are you proud to be Albertan? Are you proud to be Canadian? 84% of people in Alberta are proud to be Canadian. 58% of people voting to separate are proud to be Canadian, which is really a statistic that kind of blows my mind when I listen to it. But it shows that even if they have some grievances with the federal government, and even if there's things that have them upset, or they're trying to send a message, or whatever it is, like in their core, a lot of these people are still have an attachment to Canada, still have some patriotism. So if you can tap into that, it goes from 27% down to 11 or 12% who would vote to separate. So yes, there's a threat that the number could increase as the campaign goes on. There's also a reality that it could just fizzle out and drop if people can tap into that underneath patriotism that is there. The point I'm trying to make here, though, is that we can't assume that okay, it's 27% today. That's what it'll be when the referendum happens. I think once you get into election campaigns, as we've seen again with Brexit and other referendums, these things kind of they become alive and they become about something else, and the leaders become personalities, and people start thinking about things they haven't thought about before. And I do think there's a good chance that we might see some real fluctuations this year, and numbers going up and down depending how this discussion evolves.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things I like the most about Canadian politics, but it's also the most one of the more dangerous parts, which is that the electorate will move. If you look at Quebec right now, it was 6 months ago, the Quebec Liberal Party was dead in the water. I think there was a poll that came out the other day that has them ahead. So things can change really quickly. Uh, if you were trying to make the case for Canada, are there any arguments that or tactics that you would recommend based on what you're seeing in the data? I know you just said really tap into that kind of latent patriotic pride. Are there any good or easy ways to do that? I mean, I've suggested they get Bret Hart out to sort of reanimate his mid '90s, sort of a pro Canada thing. But is it about tapping into those sort of more quote unquote regular voices? Is it political leaders? What's the way to get that sense of patriotism to the top of people's minds?
Yeah, I mean, you got to reach everybody, right? And I think that it's such a fracture, as you know, Max. It's such a fractured media ecosystem out there that, seniors generally are pretty staunchly in the Canada side. I think they'll probably listen when political leaders are up talking and when the media is covering things. And I think that's an audience that probably you can reach just through kind of traditional campaigning tactics because they pay attention in election campaigns. I assume they'll pay attention in a referendum campaign, considering they have pretty strong feelings about it. So, I think for those people, traditional campaigning works. But yeah, when you're talking about younger people and a lot of the people voting to separate or in that send a message group are younger, the people most likely to be open to that let's send a message group are men under 50, right? And they're not always following, traditional media and absorbing things the same way. So, yeah, I think you got to try alternatives. Maybe it is, celebrities or other figures. And certainly it's other tactics than just running TV ads and inviting the media and having a press conference. It's, kind of going to alternative media sites, places where they get their information from, going on podcasts, doing things that are a little bit less conventional. Because yeah, I don't think we can assume that they're going to live the referendum the same way that a 70-year-old in Calgary is going to live the referendum, which will be what the Herald says and what the global TV is reporting every night. It's going to be a different spokesperson and a different tactic, I think, to reach some of those other people.
Yeah, that's the part. That's another part of this that keeps me up at night is that this is the first independence referendum we've seen in this kind of a media environment. Brexit was it was social media was a thing, Twitter was a thing, obviously, but it was number one a different Twitter. and it was still a world where the mainstream media, especially in Great Britain, really held a lot of sway. And as you say, especially among younger voters, it just doesn't matter anymore what happens on the evening news or what's in the Herald. And I just don't think we know how it is going to unfold over the next weeks and months. We laugh, or at least, I chuckle at the idea that, the separatists are getting an endorsement from Rob Schneider on Twitter, but I don't know, maybe stuff like that helps them, helps the separatists. I just don't think we know, and that is, yeah, it's one of the bigger risk factors for those of us who want to keep this thing on the rails. Um, I want to switch gears here just for a quick sec. You're doing some polling, obviously in Alberta, about Alberta. We'll talk about the results for the NDP in a second, but you are a lifelong Alberta Liberal, which is as much a sacrifice as a calling, I guess. Is Alberta becoming more liberal? Is this actually happening? Are we going to see in a federal election where the Liberals win 10 seats at some point? It feels to me like, seeing the recent poll numbers, there's something happening. But what do you make of it?
Yeah, like I mean, if you look at the polling averages and the aggregators out there, I think the Liberals are even in the worst polls polling well above where they were in the last election campaign in Alberta, like into the 30+% range. And depending which poll you want to buy, I think they're in a position to pick up 3 seats in some, and maybe like 10 or 12 seats in addition to what they already have in other ones. So. There's some opportunity there. Mark Carney, as we talked about, is from Alberta. I think there's always a bit of a kind of hometown buy-in that happens there. When I was doing the polling for Prime Minister Trudeau back in the day, his connection to BC, even though he wasn't even born there, but he had lived there, and people kind of looked at him as somebody who understands BC. And in campaigns we would lean into that. We'd have him climbing the grouse grind and being out in BC nature and things like that. Because people did say, okay, like he lived here for a long time. I think he kind of understands us a bit better. And I think Carney's got a bit of that going for him. And, maybe it didn't fully materialize in the last election because he didn't have time to tell that story. But I think in the year since he's been prime minister, he certainly has shown a willingness to help Alberta, to, be supportive of a new pipeline. Obviously, some skepticism, I'm sure, whether or not that will actually happen, but I think he's at least kind of talking the talk that people want to hear and showing that he has the not just the history of like having grown up in Alberta, but actually has a bit of a psyche of understanding what matters to Alberta. So I think that's helping a lot. I also do wonder if the talk of separatism is playing to his strengths in some respect. The talk of Trump and the kind of we need a stable, steady hand. In charge right now in this world of chaos is helping him in other parts of the country. And I think you've got Trump still present in Alberta as a threat, but you've also got this separatism talk. And I wonder if like just Carney being a guy who seems like in an uncertain world, like he's the guy we want, that could be helping him to some extent in Alberta as well too. Some of the polling we've done would show that, the places he's making gains in Alberta are among all the people that are most concerned about separatism, like we mentioned, seniors, some immigrants as well too, for example. So I think, that could be having a bit of a factor here as well too. Now, it's all hypothetical until we actually have an election, and there may not be an election for another 3 years now, given recent events. So,
Yeah.
the liberal numbers might fizzle out by then, but yeah, like if there was an election today, I for sure think there would be some opportunity for them to pick up some seats in Calgary and Edmonton.
One of the things that I've been a little perplexed by lately is seeing all these polls putting the Liberals 30s. I think I've even seen some in the 40s in Alberta, and it not translating through to a stronger provincial NDP vote, because you would think every single, or almost every single, federal Liberal would support the provincial NDP, and I just couldn't really square that circle. Your recent poll has them, the NDP, well ahead in Edmonton, ahead in Calgary. I think it maps to an NDP win, maybe an NDP majority. It's the first good poll I think I've seen for Naheed Nenshi in a while. The headline number, he's behind, but I think it would be an NDP government. Are you seeing something different than the other pollsters? Like, what does your data say that the other polls maybe are missing?
Yeah, and I don't. I saw Corey Hogan was saying it could be an NDP win with that. I don't think it would be based on those numbers, but it certainly would be competitive. Down by 7 province-wide, but leading in the two big cities. To your first point, I do think most federal liberals are voting for the provincial NDP, but 40% is a phenomenally great number for the federal liberals. 40% is not a phenomenally great number for the provincial NDP. It's a different map. They need to actually win the province. The federal liberals will be happy to win a few ridings here or there, right? So, that the reality is that the provincial NDP need to get people who are voting for Pierre Poilievre to also vote for Naheed Nenshi. They do need to reach into that group of people. So, they need to make sure that the stigmas that maybe are attached to the NDP brand provincially, don't get worn by the current leader and the current iteration of them. In terms of the polling, different pollsters like we include leader names in the questions. I think Smith is a bit of a drag on the brand. If you're not including leader names, that might be helping the conservatives in some other polls, especially where just like conservative is such a strong brand and her personal brand is not great. Like that could be making a bit of a difference. But look, I think the reality is, until you get into an election campaign, people aren't really thinking about this stuff too clearly. Rachel Notley was leading in many polls in the lead up to the last provincial election, and then you get into the crucible of an election, and end result was that didn't happen. So, I think Alberta is clearly established as a two-party state now. The NDP are competitive. I think the degree of competitiveness varies a bit poll to poll. But the referendum that we were just talking about is a huge wild card in all this. Like we said, it splits the UCP, and I think this is going to be the thing that Albertans are going to be talking about a lot this year, more than anything else. So stay tuned, I guess, in terms of how those vote numbers move as a result of that.
Do you see any room in the landscape for I think they're called conservative progressives? Is there any appetite or interest in another party on the political map, or is this going to be another one of those short-lived new political parties that dies on the vine?
Yeah, you could fill volumes of books about fringe Alberta political parties that never led to much of anything. But you also have a few examples of fringe Alberta political movements that have spawned dynasties over the years. If you want to go back to Social Credit and the United Farmers and things like that. So, yeah, I don't think we can be dismissive. The reality is that there are a lot of people out there who are conservative leaning, but are a little bit unhappy with Daniel Smith personally, and certainly unhappy about the separatism, drive or that she's they would say that she's maybe allowing. So I think you've got some dissatisfaction there, and look, there's people that are probably unhappy with the NDP and Nenshi for various reasons as well too. So yeah, there's a potential there. There's always a potential in the middle. These things often come down to organization, and always a chicken and egg. If you're not seen to be viable, then like why would I waste my vote here? But if this group could become seen as being viable because they have candidates and they have a few good polls and things like that, then yeah, I think the Alberta seems to be maybe not at Quebec's level in terms of being willing to shake up things in election campaigns, but after Quebec, I think they've been as willing as an electorate to kind of like radically swing during election campaigns and give new movements a chance. And I don't think you can discount any other new movement out there because there is some dissatisfaction with both Smith and Nenshi out there. So when there's dissatisfaction for the two main options on the table, then yeah, people are always going to look at another option if it's seen as a real option.
With that in mind, let's imagine a scenario where the UCP wins the next election, the NDP underperforms. Could we see the revival of the Alberta Liberal Party? I certainly counted myself among those who kind of thought it was a dead letter even a couple of years ago. The Liberal brand seemed to have enormous amounts of negative equity in it, but as we've seen now, at least at the federal level, it is back with a vengeance. And maybe the Alberta Liberal Party could follow suit. Do you see a world where they are the official sort of non-conservative option in the next provincial election?
Yeah, I mean, I was somebody who put a lot of time in with the Alberta Liberals. I door knocked for David Swan and Harry Chase and Dave Taylor and a few of their other candidates in Calgary back in the day. Um, It doesn't feel like it. I think the thing I look at is like if this party didn't exist, would you see a need to create it? And I think that the provincial NDP are basically filling the space that the provincial Liberals used to fill. Now, you know, maybe there'd be an opportunity to merge some groups together and create something new. And you're always open to those types of ideas, but I don't know if the Liberal vehicle is the one for that because much like the NDP brand, like there's some stigma on the Liberal brand, and we just talked about like the federal Liberals are doing great in Alberta, but great is 35%, 40%. Like it's not at the level where they would be winning an election provincially, right? So,
Okay.
um, I don't hold out a lot of hope or optimism that the provincial Liberal brand will revive itself. But brands change over time. There was a PC party, and then the PC party disappeared and was replaced by something else. And on either the left or the right, I think that's always a possibility that 20 years from now, it'll be two completely different entities in Alberta.
Where do you fall on the, and this will be my last question for you. Where do you fall on the idea of a rebrand for the NDP? Is it more trouble than it's worth? We saw in BC with the BC Liberals rebranding and basically running their party into the ground. But you've seen in Saskatchewan, and obviously the great success of the Sask party there. Is it worth the Alberta NDP's time to? I mean, they can't do it now, but maybe after the next election to think seriously about a brand new brand.
Yeah, it's worth considering. They've obviously taken a very minor step in terms of delinking from the membership side of things, which I think certainly makes sense organizationally, if nothing else. So, I don't think you want to tie yourself to Avi Lewis at this moment right now if you're the Alberta NDP. So I think the more distance you can show, the better. When it comes to a brand, I think ultimately people will look at the leaders more so than the party brands. And, I think it's more kind of on Nenchi's shoulders right now in terms of how he and what he makes the NDP all about. I think people will look at them as different than Rachel Notley's NDP for better or worse because it's a new leader. And whether or not the name is the same or different, I don't know if it makes a huge difference at the end of the day. I think it's a discussion. I'm sure if the NDP don't win the next election campaign, I'm sure they'll have that discussion. Um, but we've got a case study, as you said, of this going horribly awry recently. So I think that maybe makes people a little bit gun shy about these types of exercises. Especially when this is a brand that at least has been viable the last couple of election campaigns. I don't think you'd want to completely toss that overboard.
Fair. I lied. I have one more question. Can I put you on the spot on an over under on the referendum results?
Sure, yeah.
So I'll put the over under line at 26.5% for support for separation. Where do you fall?
Yeah, look, I have said it's unpredictable. I think I would probably have to go with the over on that, just because, as we've talked about, there's a risk of complacency, of potential turnout advantages for the yes side, and I do think this thing could kind of unravel in a very different direction than it is in right now. So yeah, I don't know if you put the line at 30, I don't know if I would necessarily
Hmm.
take the over, but I think there's certainly a chance it could go over 30. And that's something that everybody has to be very mindful of. We shouldn't just be, blissfully sleepwalking towards this thing, assuming it's going to, peter out and be a complete nothing burger. I think there will be moments, at least in the election, when we get polls that have support for separatism, 30, maybe 35. Maybe we'll get a poll with it at 40 at some point, right? So I think there's this is going to be a bit of an up and down roller coaster, I suspect, assuming we're headed towards a October referendum. And people need to be very live to that.
Yeah, if there's one thing you can bet on in Alberta, that's that things will be very interesting, and folks like us will be very busy. So, appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about it, and encourage everyone who watches this to follow you on your Substack, and because you put out some really interesting information there, and stay tuned for, I guess, more polls to come on separatism. Thanks, Dan.
No problem.